I'm so happy to be in community with all of you. Phenomenal people that we have on this panel. So Ellie, why don't you go ahead and introduce our two speakers coming up.
Hi all, my name is Ellie. I use she, they pronouns. I am an intern and organizer with Arizona Jews for Justice in Early Tzedek. And we are so lucky to have some wonderful, wonderful speakers today. First, we have Analucía, who is a Peruvian Chilean American Jutina, born in Peru and raised in Spain and the United States. An anti-oppression advocate, educator, and researcher, Analucía founded Jutina Eco in 2019 to offer Latin Jews from around the world a platform in which to celebrate and engage in critical dialogue about Jewish and Latin multiculturalism. Prior to starting this company, she worked at One Table, the Center to Advance Racial Equity in Portland, Oregon, and organized as a migrant right advocate in California's Central Valley, southwestern Mexico, and southeastern Peru. Analucía's educational background lies in critical race and cross-cultural studies, and her doctoral research was centered around Latino immigrant and refugee resiliency. She's a recipient of the National Young Women of Distinction Award, is a former Fulbright and Rotary International Scholar, sits on JDC's Entwines Council, is a member of the Schusterman Foundation's ROI community, and is a Wexner Field Fellow. A passionate global citizen, she traveled to over 125 countries and has lived in 5 continents. We're so excited to have you today, Analucía. And then our other wonderful speaker today is Kimmy, is a California native with a global spirit. Born into a multicultural home, she discovered the best way to explore her dynamic Jewish identity was to immerse and involve herself in the world, beginning with tracing her roots to rural El Salvador, Europe, and Israel. A seasoned international Jewish educator, Kimmy is passionate about providing a safe space for people to develop deeper connections to their Latin Jewish identity. Her passion for community healing led her to join the Jutina Eco company at the Jutina Eco team as the community coordinator in charge of innovative identity wellness programming. Prior to working with them, she was a Jewish educator at Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles, California, and the Jewish Community Center in Mumbai, India. Kimmy is a graduate of the American Jewish University, where she was selected to be the valedictorian of her graduating class. She is a former JDC Entwine Jewish Service Corps Fellow, a Jeremiah Fellowship alumna, and is creator of Learn, Grow, Rise, a yoga, wellness, and conscious activism platform. Welcome, everyone. We are going to start off with, and go in whatever order you feel most comfortable with. We're going to start off with our first question, which is, what was your experience with representation like growing up? And has it changed at all now that you are an adult?
I'll go ahead and start us off if folks are okay with that. I love this, being in community with two of my favorite people and two amazing leaders in our Jewish community that have just really been groundbreaking. I've had the honor to personally work with both Kimmy and Analucía, who have just this amazing spot in my heart for what leadership looks like in our Jewish communities. For me, representation has always been so important, to see that folks that look like us, that speak like us, are in spaces of leadership. And I mean that in a way that is representative of what our community is asking for and what our community stands for. Leadership has always been such an important part of our community, to see that folks that can identify like us gives inspiration to the rest of the community to say that, yes, you can be a part of this. Yes, you can lead this. And it continues to give growth within our own self and our futures of what that leadership might actually be, and the way that we take in space and the way that we look to form community. So I'm gonna let everybody else answer the same question. Thank y'all.
That was beautifully said, Eddie. And hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be with you all. Thank you for making the time. Representation to me in my community, I would definitely echo everything that Eddie said. And by the way, Eddie, I look up to you so much, just as a friend, as a human, as an organizer and a leader. So thank you for being you. But I would say, in addition to leadership really mirroring who I am and who I'm connected to. I would also say in our education system, I want to see my multicultural self represented in Jewish education. I've worked as an educator for many years, and there wasn't, there was education around Sephardic Jews. There was actually there's some brief knowledge about some Jews in certain communities around Latin America, but it was very, like, just the surface was scratched upon, and there's so much there. And so that would mean a lot to me, to see education around the multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial diversity and beauty within the Latin Jewish community and within the whole global Jewish family in Jewish education spaces, especially within the United States. So that's a big one for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimmy, and thank you, Eddie. Hi, everyone. Analucía here. And I think it's interesting when we talk about representation, because on the one end, I wholeheartedly believe that representation matters. It's important to get people whose identities have fallen on the periphery of dominant culture, primarily moved by white supremacy culture, to be given the opportunities to stand in positions that allow other people whose identities are also that fall on the periphery to see themselves as having the opportunity to be in those spaces. On that same note, I think it's also important to note that representation can also be tricky, because all of a sudden people become very easily the token person for a particular community, or they become like the spokesperson for everyone. And for myself, like, I really think about this as a very vocal Latina Jew, a Jutina, that my goal as an activist and as someone who believes wholeheartedly in increasing representation of people who have been marginalized by the Jewish community, to really not see my story as the end all be all story for Latin Jews. Okay. And so what is it that, and even in our own like activist circles amongst like people of color and myself and Kimmy and Eddie, we're always kind of in conversation about this, being Latin Jews, is who else should be sharing their story? Because if we really look at it, Kimmy, Eddie, and myself, we might have a lot of similarities, but we have a lot of differences. And it's important to create a culture of understanding that we are only as rich as our multiculturalism, and how not only, how do we kind of fall less dependent on like what we see in books and what we see in pictures and what we see in leaders, and rather how do we also, or conjunctly, like how do we also elevate people to feel pride in their own story and in their own intersectionality, and learn how to kind of decolonize their own story and tell their story so that it becomes a natural process of creating an actively multicultural world.
Absolutely. Those were all seriously such incredible answers. I think that even just having this conversation is one step of many, but obviously having that representation, again, without avoiding tokenization and things like that, is something really important to be focusing on and talking about. My next question for everyone, we can take the same order if you guys would like to avoid any chaos, is what changes need to be made within major Jewish institutions, and what is currently working well?
And go ahead, Analucía. I saw that you unmuted really quickly. You're passionate about this. I love it. Go ahead.
Well, I want to say that there's a lot. We're on a long-term journey, right? This commitment, and I think this question is something that we should always be asking ourselves, like on a weekly basis at our board meetings, like what else can we be doing? Like knowing that the what else, the how can I help, how else can we be elevating and lifting up voices should become normative language in our leadership. And with that, I think, with the top list of that is also thinking about like our funding, and how are we funding initiatives, and how are we funding programs that are being named from the ground and on a grassroots level as being vital to a cultivation of Jewish culture and Jewish community. And I think that, oftentimes as an executive director for a Latin Jewish organization, I get asked the question, oh, so is the goal of this to bring in unengaged Latin Jews and then connect them to the Jewish community? And my answer is like, this is Latin Jewish community. What we've created is Latin Jewish community. So I think what's also very much needed is not thinking of certain initiatives and programs as being stepping stones to like normative American, Jewish life, but rather in addition to, like, this is part of American Jewish life. So that like shift is very important. And so how we think about funding, how we think about partnerships, for members of our community to self-actualize, to continue to self-actualize and continue to lead initiatives that are central to the identity of American Judaism.
Thank you, Analucía. To echo all the beautiful words that you just said, I think that there's an important piece to acknowledge that the work is working. Like, right, like this is a work in progress, like Analucía was said, and something that I really love about the Jewish community is the self-analyzing aspect of being able to say, you know what, we may have messed up, but we're working on getting a lot better. We're working on how is it that we can raise voices, how is it that we can look internally to be able to deconstruct some of the biases that we may have had, and start to build something that works for all of us, right? Even from the leadership point of view, I've really loved seeing a lot of organizations that are looking at like highlighting leadership within JOC voices, Jews of color. And that was so beautiful to see. And just like Analucía said, to echo that, this is a continuous work, right? And that with that continuousness of that work, it becomes a struggle of how much energy can we continue to put into this, and are we analyzing the right amount of time and resources that we're putting into this? And I think that we're steadily getting there, right? But it is a continuous struggle of being able to be spearheading that work continuously, right? And it isn't just doing the work when it's a headline. When we see that racial justice is the palatable thing to talk about. It's continuing the work even far beyond that, continuing to work furthering the conversations that are needed to be had. That's where we're really starting to build legway. That's where we're going to start to build communities that work for all of us. So yeah, I think that for one, we're doing really great on making sure that the work is getting there. And I think the struggle is always going to be that continuation of the work, to making sure that folks still understand that this is necessary, that this is the work that must be had and done.
I don't have much else to add because I think Analucía and Eddie really summed that up in such a beautiful and articulate way. And, for me, I think the Jewish community is doing a lot of reflection right now and a lot of deep diving into, perhaps the ways that they have, where they have overlooked certain aspects of the community. Because I think sometimes the community has been so focused on this like bigger idea of like community and sustainability, but there's a lot of people who've been lost along the way. And of course, like this, I don't, like, we only assume best intentions, right? So we're all one community, but like Eddie and Analucía, we're really emphasizing that this isn't just about like folding us into the mix and being like, yeah, and we see and we love the Latin Jews and we love the Jews of color. And it's really like, what do you need to feel fully supported and thriving and in leadership and expansive as you are, elevated, centered, all of the things. And it's not about trying to make everyone like be here. It's like you be you, and we love you and we support you, and we can honor and respect everyone with this incredible equity, with this sense of equity and lifting everyone in the same way. And to really emphasize again, it's progress. It's a long game. It's a marathon. It's every day, for generations and generations to come. And in that process requires unlearning as well. And so I'm even finding myself like thinking about, well, where did I learn that? And why does it have to be that way? And who taught me that, and this is the world is changing in a lot of ways. And so we're being expanded in both mind and heart. How can we think differently? And in that thinking differently, let's make sure that we're including every single voice, and that voice has all the things that they need. Thank you.
Incredible answers. Thank you, guys. I have some pre-written individual questions because you each have such unique experiences that I would hate to give you all some very broad questions this entire time. You deserve a little bit more than that. So my first question is going to be for Analucía, which is going to be, from your experience, what do you believe is the best way to merge cultures together while still highlighting them as separate entities, but still united?
Yeah, I guess I can see that from a couple of different points. Like I see it from like an intergroup, like for example, if we were like something that we work on is, okay, what does it look like for Latin Jews to have a, intergroup experience with, Black Jews in America? But for this question, I want to focus on like intra-group, right? Because the Latino community is actually one of the most diverse communities in the world. We're multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, and the only other ethno identity that cultural identity can really like live up to that is the Jewish identity, as also a very multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural community. And so I think like within our own particular group, there is a lot of work that needs to be done, especially because Latinos, Latinx folks living in America depending on where you've grown up, depending on the access that you've had, depending on the color of your skin, depending on like your legal status, on a wide range of things, impacts the way in which you think you relate with other communities of color or other communities that have been marginalized by whiteness in the world. And so for us as an organization, it's been so imperative to think, okay, like let's create this space, knowing that this is something that if you're in this space, you want to, tackle head on a number of the ways in which systems of oppression have lived within our own community and how those systems continue to play out, how we oppress one another in different ways. And I think that kind of very clear conversation and that intention, that kavanah with that learning really supports the desire for our community to do a lot of their own breakthroughs around where did I learn, as Kimmy said, like where did I learn this? What does it take to unlearn, unpack, and relearn? And also, how do I create like a system of continued reflection and reflexivity, as to use a social work term, around continuously being like on essentially when it comes to thinking. And that has been really important for us because as we continue to think about intergroup alliances and intergroup coalition, especially when it comes to different communities in the United States, it's imperative that we have a very critical analysis of race structures and oppression structures within our community. And so I really find that the best way in which we as Latino, Latinx folks can be in coalition and work as strongly and as, with a similar mission with another community, it's through having had a deep reflection and introspection as to where have we internalized hate within ourselves and how has that impeded us from actually being in coalition, in terms of being in more active allyship with other communities.
Absolutely. It was like soaking up, I was like a sponge right there. That was such great information and such great analysis of kind of what's going on in the psychology and really the oppression that white supremacy has really had on different groups kind of coming together. And I think that was extremely insightful. So thank you for that one. My next question is for Eddie. And this question is going to be, what does immigration representation look like within Jewish institutions, and how do we make progress on that?
Thank you. I think that there's a different understanding of complexity when you look at status as a barrier of leadership. For example, when folks want to be placed in positions of leadership, and there's leadership development that looks at international travel, well, that might suppress different folks from being able to have access to that leadership development. if there's things that are out of the United States, or if there's things that are in the United States and folks have no access to documentation, it becomes really hard to have that, be able to have that leadership role, to have that representation. And I think that it's oftentimes a conversation that's not had as much, to talk about documentation and to talk about status. I remember I honestly cried when I found out, like, Analucía, that when both her and I were in a leadership program where we privately shared that we both were undocumented. Like, to me, that was such a beautiful thing, to be able to say that I'm in a Jewish leadership program, and I'm able to find somebody that knows my struggle, that knows my feeling, and that is in a position of leadership, of also having a doctorate, of having the power to lead an organization, create an organization, inspires me in my own organization here of not only Uriel Tzaddik, but Arizona Jews for Justice, to say, like how we say in Spanish, si se puede, yes, we can. That's why it's so important for me to see the conversations had of documentation, of migration, so that folks can analyze that, right? And often in spaces we tend to see like, oh, I didn't know that, or oh, I didn't understand that. When other folks are talking about being able to be in that leadership position, oftentimes we neglect talking about status in general. So I really want different orgs to start to think about how that is pointed out and how that looks like in our societies.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of one of the senses about representation going beyond what people look like. That's one of the things where you get to know someone and you have representation within similar shared experiences and struggles, which is another really important form of representation that I'm glad we could talk about a little bit today. Kimmy, my question for you is, what message would you have for young Jews of color or other marginalized Jews who feel discouraged because of lack of representation?
I love that question. It's something I actually think about a lot, because I wonder, you know, what would little me, young me, wish, you know, what would it empower me when I was young? You know, I would say my biggest message would be proud of who you are and dig deeper, dig deep into your roots and find pride in who you are. And even, you know, even if sometimes you feel like you're walking that road alone, or you might not see people who have the same story or history or connections that you do, don't lose your you and go back to your roots and find strength in your roots. That's the biggest thing that I've walked away with. Like I moved from like the start of the Zoom to now, I moved over here because I have this painting of El Salvador that I got on a trip a few years ago. And I'm so proud to be Salvadorian. And there was a long time in my life where I wasn't. I disconnected from my identity. I felt I felt shame around my identity. And when I think about that now, that's really sad. That's who I am. That's my blood. That's my family. That's my story. I look at myself in the mirror and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a Salvadorian woman and I have Mayan roots and I'm an indigenous woman. And for so long, I cut myself off from that. And it created a lot of insecurity in me. It created a lot of disconnection. And I feel very blessed to have been part of a Jewish community that loved me and I was offered so many incredible opportunities, but I never was in touch with all of the layers of who I was. I was in touch with the Ashkenazi part of me. I was in touch with, you know, just like I was in touch with what it means to be Jewish, but not in the way that my bones feel Jewish and not in the way that my ancestors felt Jewish. And so my message to everybody is to find your connection and really like relentlessly stay connected to it and reach out to your ancestors, your grandparents, aunts, your uncles, cousins, talk to whoever you can and get as much information about your family as possible. Because I know sometimes it's hard and you might not know where to start. And there might not be the right book or the right, music that you'll find right away, but there are things out there. You just have to dig a little bit. Sometimes we have to ask for help. Sometimes it's hard, but to keep going. Like that's the biggest thing that I tell my inner me, is to really stay connected to those roots, because from that place you can grow. And for a while I was just a tree in the ground, disconnected from my roots, and I was falling over in lots of parts in my life. But now I'm like, I'm in there, and I want everyone to be there too.
Wrong button. On that topic, Kimmy, can you also elaborate a little bit on how we keep our own mental health as Jews of color leadership? This came from another person. I'm clearly not Jews of color leadership. When there are so many issues to face on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a big one. And I think, it's almost assumed in the Jewish community that everyone has access to wellness and mental health, and even, the financial stability and security to even just on a basic level, like nutrition, right? That has we know so much in our science, right? That has our nutrition and our physical health has such an impact on our mental health. I think it's assumed in the Jewish community because the very mainstream community is doing great, that everyone is fine, but that's not the case. It's not the case for everyone, and that awareness is critical for the communities of, I would say, particularly for communities of color that are, all along the socioeconomic spectrum, but we know that there are particularly more Jews of color who are in have less access. And I would say the biggest thing is to there's so many things on this, and I'll just like to back up a little bit. Like, why I love what we do in Jutina is because we create space to have the conversations and name these things that are really hard. And that in itself is a mental health practice. Like, having a safe space to be able to be your full self is like the biggest exhale for the soul and for the mind and for the body. So finding safe spaces where you are seen, where you are held, where you can just be all of you with your people, and to, and also finding things. And then this is just like wellness advice is, finding things that really make your body feel good, because our body stores pain and fear and any kind of system of oppression that's happening on the outside. It still lives inside of us in some way. No matter how many years of therapy you're doing, there's still stuff inside of you. And so releasing that out through the body in any way that feels good to you, whether that's going for a walk, yoga, gardening, cooking, moving your body, using your hands, whatever it is, and committing to some kind of practice. And I think a lot of times in spaces of people of color, we don't often, and I can definitely say this for my family, we were workers, and self-care and rest was not a thing. It was just not a thing. We worked 8 days a week. It's just what we did. And so it's funny now that I'm a yoga teacher and I'm all about wellness and rest, but I learned that as a response to being in survival mode my whole life and seeing my whole family in survival mode. So really creating the opportunity for people to rest, to feel safe, and to give yourself care, and just knowing that you're worthy and you deserve it. But most importantly, you need to feel safe in order to be able to rest on that worthiness. So I want us all to invest in creating that for each other.
I feel like I just had a moment of self-care within myself just listening to you. That was so peaceful. My next big question is going to be for Analucía. And this one is, I love throwing the complex questions at you because I know I'm going to get similarly complex answers, but how do we thrive in leadership roles without feeling tokenized?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I want to expand the question to be, how can we keep our organizations accountable so that when we're thinking about how we want to prioritize racial equity, that we don't tokenize others. So I think it's so important, because oftentimes it falls on people of color, on people whose identities are for the first time being seen on a board, on staff, in systems that haven't necessarily been given the proper evaluation to see how it is that white supremacy culture has embedded itself all throughout our policies, and the way we think about programming, the way we think about funding, the way we think about hiring, so on and so forth. And so when we do bring on, especially when we're trying to make changes and we're making changes that at times feel like need to happen right away, the first question I think should be versus, versus the person of color who might be invited to step on a board or to consider a position in a white-led organization, is really kind of turn that back on the organization and say, like, what is your plan to actually have racial equity be a sustained aspect of, your work? And what are other ways in which you are allowing for folks whose identities have never been represented at the table to truly be able to be, for their voices to truly be heard at the table? Like, what kind of training has your board had to specifically work across cultural differences and to be able to engage in a relationship that doesn't necessarily see newcomers, and tokenization happens in a wide range. It happens racially, it happens gender, it happens with age, it happens with physical ability.
We lost you there for a little bit, Analucía.
Prioritizing thinking.
We lost you there for a little bit, for a little 30 seconds of what you said we lost.
Uh-oh, what was the last thing you heard?
You were talking about tokenizing people with different abilities and gender, age.
Got it. Thank you. So what I was saying is, I think it's important for the person who is being invited to step into these roles to know that, you're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you to be on that board, but also that for the people that are in that position of power, both on the board and for on hiring practices, to straight up name, like, this is where our practices are at this moment in time. These are where our evaluation has led us to kind of think about where we are. These are our limitations. This is where we're wanting to grow. You're not going to be the only person that we're seeing as the person who is going to be, the representative of all people of color or of all women. And we have a commitment to being able to increase more voices at the table. And so, I always think about there's strength in numbers, and there's also strength in representation and immediate representation, and knowing that the difference between tokenization and representation is, does that person's ability to engage, is it really going to be listened to, and is it really going to be worthy of any discussion, or is the only reason why they're there, to sit as silent members and to vote with whatever everyone else is voting? So I think that comes down with the culture that's being embedded, and one of many reasons that when I speak to people of color who are interested or who have been asked to join certain boards, that they also know what questions to ask of them to see if it's going to be a right fit for them, and also to slow certain processes down. If they're interested in something and they say, I'm interested in serving on this board, and I think here are a couple more things that need to be done before I'm able to be there, then that's okay too. That's part of a collective community process. But I think we're still so afraid of slowing things down that we sometimes jump to yes without an actual organizational shift that needs to take place, so that culturally people aren't just being brought in to be tokenized, but to actually succeed and to contribute to the growth of any particular organizing body.
Incredible. That exactly what I was hoping to get, was such a great answer out of you. Some wonderful insight. My follow-up question for that one is going to be that Jews of color are gaining amplification in voices. What do you believe should be the main message we portray in these Jewish spaces?
Was that one for me?
Yeah.
Can you say that again? Sorry, Ellie.
No worries. Jews of color are gaining amplification in voices. What do you believe should be the main message portrayed in Jewish spaces?
I will say that many Jews of color are being given platforms to speak, but there's many more whose voices still need to be lifted. So I want to just like preface that. And I think that so many efforts by so many different community organizations are doing just that, you know, saying that like, we're just getting started and we still have a lot to listen to. And so with that in mind, I would say that if any sometimes if organizations will say, okay, you know, over the past year, this is what we've done, that's really wonderful. And if we continue to go back to that notion of this being, you know, end game, this is like something sustainable that we're committing to in terms of switching and the way in which we are interpreting
We just lost you again. Oh no. Analucía, can you hear us? She's coming back. She's coming back. I can feel it. Analucía.
the way that is much more in tune with the mosaic of the Jewish people.
We lost you for a little bit.
I think what I said.
Okay, perfect.
All right, incredible. A question for everyone, which is, we know that progress cannot be made while the minds of the unaffected remain unaware. How do we effectively influence the minds of the unaffected, AKA privileged Jews that aren't in marginalized communities?
Definitely. I'll go ahead and start this. I think it's such a great conversation to be had here, because I think that even in the progressive movement, we typically preach to ourselves, right? Like we collectively kind of just like agree on what we actively believe in. We kind of validate each other's points. What we need to have changes on are how do we change the minds of those folks who are unaffected? When we talk about racial justice, how do we change the minds of folks that don't face any sort of suppression based off of their race? How do we change the minds of those who are unaffected by any migration status? How do we continuously change the mind of those folks who have little to no affection because of systems of oppression? That is the conversation that we truly need to have. In typical times, these conversations they're not fun. They're uncomfortable, right? When we're having these conversations, even within our own leadership teams, what are we talking about? How are we integrating these conversations with folks who may not really agree with what we're saying? I think that is a first step, and then making it personal. Are we like, for me, I typically am very open about my undocumented status. I want more folks to be able to know how much of a struggle it is and how hard it is to gain citizenship. Because when you personalize something, you create almost an attachment to the story. You have a physical story and a presence and a face to it. It's no longer a number, a statistic, or a word. It is something that is flesh. It's something that is in front of you, sharing your stories, because our stories may be different, but the feelings that we get from those stories, the emotions that we feel, folks may not have the same story of my migration journey of crossing through the desert, but folks will understand what it is to feel helpless, what it is to feel fear, what it is to feel sadness. When we connect on those aspects of those feelings is when we start to really shift in the way that folks feel and the way that folks talk about things. That's how we start to shift the agenda of the folks who aren't really affected by things, is through sharing our story, through being a little bit vulnerable, but sharing it with the folks who sometimes don't even agree with us, right? Breaking that barrier. So that folks can have a different idea of what is happening, of how we go into things, of how we live our day-to-day lives.
I'd love to add on to that in the value of vulnerability. It's so powerful because it's a reminder of our shared humanity. And when there are, particularly in, communities of privilege that are really on the just like access to all the things, it's easy to forget. It's easy to forget how hard life can be. And naturally, as humans, I think we're conditioned to pursue comfort, and we're conditioned to stay where it's safe. And we even do that in the avenues of our mind as well. We don't even try to venture into difficult truths of other people's realities or experiences, let alone our own. Like, think about how many hard things that we unconsciously hide in our own minds or in our own hearts. So, you know, everything inside of us happens outside of us. And so what we're seeing in our world is the playing out of pushing difficult circumstances out of our eyes view. And what we have to do is to, you know, I'm going to be dramatic right now, but like, open your eyes and and really look. And you know, like what Eddie was saying is that vulnerability piece is really important. And on the other side of that, it's, you know, it's one thing for us to be, as Jews of color, to be vulnerable. And I'll just name separately, that's very emotionally laborious. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. And so I want to name that how important it is that if, you know, someone who is willing to share or is being asked to share, that they are made to feel like really safe and really respected for doing so, and honored for doing so. And the other side of the vulnerability is in, you know, the people who are listening to truly receive. And like, as hard as it is to, like, you know, open your mind and heart in that way, especially because of the conditions and the worldviews that we might all have, is to really receive that. And it's okay to not respond or have anything to say. And I think a lot of people, Analucía was speaking about this before, that a lot of people's reaction might be like, well, what's the solution and how do we fix it, and like, oh my gosh, this is unjust, like we need to do something immediately. But that's not always the answer, right? That's not going to change everything overnight. And this is the long game. And we can't lose steam on this, because these are lives, period. So yeah, the vulnerability, the respect, the shared humanity. Yeah, that's all I got for that. So thank you.
I'll quickly add that I think there is a hyper focus. I mean, it's necessary. Like it's important that there is a focus on the experience of people of color in the United States of America, and specifically on the lives of Black, Indigenous people of color who have been systemically, you know, whose histories have been systemically erased and who have been systemically oppressed since really the arrival to the Americas. And I also think that sometimes people feel that in order to relate to something that's happening, you need to have a very specific tie to some form of suffering. So in other words, kind of relate to someone via shared trauma. And I think that it's a very complicated thing to do, especially if you don't have a mental health professional around you, because what that ends up leaving is promoting, like sparking trauma once again and continuing with that. And something that I found has been also powerful in just kind of locating ourselves when it comes to oppression is taking moments to see when we've internalized various elements of oppression. And so for people of color who walk this world and whose identities that have been marginalized are much more outwardly noticed, there's things that, you know, oppression kind of lives like on their sleeve. But for people, especially folks who are like white functioning, who are able, whose abilities seem to be, you know, that people seem to be fully ably functioning, there might still be a lot of things that we don't understand, because we've internalized also a desire to stay shut, to stay quiet, to not necessarily express when it is that we are experiencing various other levels of mental health, of pain and of trauma. And I want to lift this up during Mental Health Awareness Month, that internalized oppression has a sustained effect on our bodies, on our minds, whether that's internalized anti-Semitism or internalized sexism, internalized racism. Those things play out not in favor of us, but rather to manage who we are and keep ourselves in line so that we can really attempt to assimilate into a greater like world order that doesn't really necessarily serve anyone but the very small community in power. And so I named that because like an internal, a practice of just like naming what does internalized oppression look like? How do I continue to be reflective about it? How do I create a community in which we can be, what are the communities around me that can support that reflective process is so crucial than just kind of falling on the crutch of like, I'm only going to understand we're lucky that we were able to connect on something so personal. Kimmy and I have been so lucky to connect on things personal, but perhaps Ellie, you and I might not, our connection might not be so outwardly focused, but yet we can still connect on the fact that we've likely experienced internalized oppression in various ways. And together we can kind of work towards our own liberation.
Absolutely. We have our next big question is for everyone, which is what tangible changes can be made to uplift JOC voices?
I'll go ahead and start. I think the easiest thing is to listen to those voices. It's like the easiest, most tangible thing that you can do that any org, any group, any community org can do, can process, can make happen. Just literally listen. That is one of the best steps, one of the best ways to start to listen to like what's step one. And that's just like step one, right?
I'll also, on top of that, yes, listening and just how critical it is to have JOC spaces that are really honored for JOC communities, and even like micro communities within the JOC community, like Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, Black folks, like everyone to have like their own little communities to really be in those spaces of healing, of connection, of strengthening, and having that be supported by the community. There are, of course, are a number of other things to do, but just like starting points is like listening and those in community members having safe places to really I don't want to say find their strength because everyone's already strong, but to stand in strength together.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and just to echo, saying yes to both of my friend Eddie and Kimmy. I'll do a shameless plug, for Jutinaico, one of our premier programs is called Voces, and the whole purpose is to elevate as many Latin Jewish voices as possible, because for us as a Latin Jewish community, it's so imperative that people know that just because you know me or just because you know Kimmy doesn't mean you understand what the experience of the Latin Jewish community really is. And our Voces, which is our publication, allows people to write their story in their own terms, the way they feel, lifting up what they feel is important to lift up. And really through that concept of decolonizing storytelling and giving people the opportunity to collectively create this mosaic, this archive that's a mosaic that we've created collectively, is a way in which we're elevating Latin Jewish stories. And those stories, anyone can read them. They're open for people to uncover, for people to sit with, to think about, and just to kind of get that sheer recognition that these stories are part of a larger multicultural story, and perhaps even inspire folks to think, where are other members in our community how can we expand certain platforms so that more people feel inspired to do so? And just like us, there's a number of other really wonderful programs. The Holashon has a great publication called Jewish and the Lunar Project, which is an Asian American film project, is doing something similar through video. And more we're seeing these affinity spaces, affinity groups kind of like release in their own desire ways in which to lift up voices in a way that they own, like we do it for ourselves. And if others can learn from it, wonderful, but we're doing it for us. And I think that that's probably one of the greatest feelings out there.
Absolutely. I think that, I think that having these kind of developments is extremely important as well with the safe spaces. We talk a lot about how it is wonderful that we have sort of safe spaces for our own mental well-being as well as for our own community. And on that topic, we have a question particularly for Kimmy, which is, what is one mental health practice you do to keep yourself going?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you, question asker, whoever said that. Well, I'll say, sometimes it's different. Like every day, my heart, my mind, my body want something that's different. And so, my first response is always like just listening. Like that in itself is one of my favorite mental health self-care practices is listening. And that came with developing a relationship to myself, of really getting to know myself and asking myself, what do I need right now? And that came from a place of creating trust from within. And so I would say most days it's in finding stillness, and maybe that looks like meditation, or maybe that looks like so I like to do like art and doodling sometimes, and so I'll just like be really focused in that, but finding some kind of activity that allows me to turn my brain off a little bit, like, or at least the chatter of my brain, and strengthen that relationship between my mind and my body, make that clear channel of communication. I like to start my days like that. And listen, I'm a yoga teacher and I meditate, but I'm also a human, and I definitely have my moments of like scatterbrain, monkey mind, all the things. And so when those things happen, my other favorite practice is to say, it's okay. And like, I hug myself. I'm like, it's okay. I'm having a moment. And that's where I like to do movement practices. Maybe I'll go for a walk. I'll exercise. I'll do yoga. I'll dance around to get that frenetic energy out of my body. So to sum it up, listening, and sometimes that's stillness, sometimes that's movement. But my biggest empowering piece of advice to anyone is make friends with the inside, and you will be happy. Thank you.
I think this was a really great question, so I'd like to extend if Analucía or Eddie would like to answer that as well.
Yeah.
Definitely. I love my self-care day is being able to read on Shabbat, be able to just like disconnect and just read a couple of books that I've been like trying to finish, right? Like just that self-care moment of taking time just for me and for nourishment and knowledge. Being able to give back to my own body of what it needs, being able to just relax outside of my porch and just be able to read and disconnect from everything that hits us consistently. Because let's be honest with ourselves, burnout is real, especially in a position of leadership. Burnout is real. So the fact that we have Shabbat to be able to like, disconnect and be able to really rejoice in that is just beautiful for me. And I think that that's one of the best mental health practices that as Jews we are able to tap into.
I think some really good self-care for me is having people that push me and encourage me. So I really value my Havruta time with Eddie and with Kimmy, and being able to just kind of have moments where I can just fully, digest and be free, and like be able to know that the person that's listening to me on the other end isn't going to just tell me what I want to hear, but is going to challenge me and is also going to hold me with love. And I think that practice of like, who are your people, like who is your folks, is such an important practice for my own self-care.
Awesome. Okay, and our final question, just to wrap us up for today, is where do you see the Jewish community going? This is for everyone.
Definitely in the context of leadership, I think whoever asked this question, I think that's where they're going for. In the context of leadership, I think that there's so much diversity that's really manifesting within our leadership in our Jewish community. So many new voices that are springing up in action. I think it's so beautiful to see that there's an emergence of new leadership, which is funny enough with this program is called. And it makes me feel really excited to what's to come, and really hopeful for when my children start growing up. My children have something to look up for. My children have the Analucias, the Kimmys, to be able to say, ¿sabes qué? Like, I can do that. I can be there, to have that in a historic standpoint, where a Jutina exists, where Arizona Jews for Justice that was led by a brown Latino man exists, where these platforms are a thing. That to me is what's exciting about our Jewish community that's building up, and we see that it's happening, right? We see that folks are diving into these programs where we're really taking those hard conversations into head and into reality. So for me, it's an excitement of seeing like where are we going and how is this happening, because we're seeing the building blocks of it currently.
Eddie, wow. That just gave me a layer of perspective that was so powerful of, 20, 30 years from now, looking back at these conversations and the movements and the work that's being done now, how it's going to impact all the future generations. It's absolutely incredible. And to answer that question, I see the definition of being Jewish, or where the community is going. It's this idea of, I think the concept of being Jewish is going to change, and but in a way of true service and true unity and true harmony and true diversity. Being Jewish isn't just going to mean, one particular idea of what's in people's mind, but being Jewish is going to be expansive. Being Jewish is going to be justice oriented in like the most authentic and most genuine terms of the word and the practice. Where is the Jewish community going? It's really going in a place of true community care, and I feel the momentum, because it's I'm personally just feeling more empowered than I ever have. And that's saying a lot, because I felt disempowered for a long time. And so, this is here to stay, and that feels good. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I see things moving in a really meaningful direction. And Eddie, like, you grounded it in like the future, like what is that future going to bring? It's the measure of success will be our children feeling really good and feeling like they have people to look up to in a really meaningful way. And I see that happening.
Yeah, I know we don't have that much time, so I'll just add that I really see the Jewish community moving away from binary thinking and necessarily saying, okay, these kind of like umbrella terms like, this is the way Ashkenazi this, or this is the way Sephardi that, and so on and so forth, and really see those umbrella terms as being homes to so many different cultures that have actually become a part of those umbrellas, and moving away from flattening Jewish identities, and not just putting the multicultural responsibility on Jews of color. As I mentioned earlier, Jews as a whole, what makes Jews Jews is our multicultural nature. And even amongst a big umbrella term like Ashkenazim, there's actually quite beautiful nuances between traditions that we see in Lithuania versus traditions we once saw in Hungary, and we once saw in Poland and Germany and Russia. And to be able to unflatten kind of Judaism the way it's kind of been flattened today to kind of fit in within this box is kind of be at what I see as like the mission of the Jewish people, to really start to untangle ourselves from this, because the way we are right now, we're only allowing ourselves to live in a binary spectrum. Cultural people. So yes to what Eddie said, yes to what Kimmy said. And if you're listening, I hope that you're thinking about your own experience and what makes your identity unique, because it is.
Thank you so much, everyone who spoke today, everyone who is joining us on Zoom and on Facebook Live. It was a pleasure hearing from these individuals, and more to come soon. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.